In 1930, two gentlemen, loosely associated with Oxford, wrote a history of England. Sort of. It was part parody, part satire, and part pure nonsense, with a lot of wordplay thrown in for fun. That book was, of course, the famous 1066 and All That, described by its authors as, quote, a memorable history of England, comprising all the parts you can remember, including 103 good things, 5 bad kings, and 2 genuine dates. This is our second attempt to try to figure out just what they're talking about. Chapter 2. Britain Conquered Again. The withdrawal of the Roman legions to take part in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
A long, tedious book concerning exactly what it says, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Written more or less concurrently with the American Revolution, this beast is 4,000 pages. That's 4 times as long as The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien is see-spot run compared to the complexity of this monster. And of course, it has very little to do with Britain. What it does, we'll get to shortly.
Due to a clamor among the Romans for pompous amusements such as bread and circumstances.
Actually, the phrase is bread and circuses, referring to corrupt politicians, which Rome was famous for, giving the people free stuff like food and entertainment to distract them from how badly the government was screwing them. Circus had nothing to do with clowns and tightrope walkers. It referred to a large, round, or oval building for chariot races. Think Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
Left Britain defenseless and subjected Europe to that long succession of waves of which history is chiefly composed. While the Roman Empire was overrun by waves not only of Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and even Goths, but also of Vandals who destroyed works of art, and Huns who destroyed everything and everybody, including Goths, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, and even Vandals.
This is probably beyond understanding, at least the way they describe it. Here's a map. You're on your own. The only thing these folks had to do with Britain is that their continental excursions were the reason for Rome pulling the legions out.
Britain was attacked by waves of Picts and, of course, Scots, who had recently learned how to climb that wall.
I'm going to try. That's all I can promise. As stated previously, there were no Picts or Scots as such at this time. There were Gaels, the precursors of the Scots in Del Riata, and an assemblage of Pictish kingdoms formed out of even more scattered tribes. There was not a unified nation of Picts. You could spend weeks in a university research library and still only scratch the surface of this topic. It's a fascinating subject, and I might try to find a way to include it in the series somewhere.
And of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who, landing at Thanet, soon overran the country with fire and, of course, the sword.
We also said this back at the end of Chapter 1, partly to prepare you for what was coming, but also because we lost our place in the book.
Important note. The Scots, originally Irish but by now Scotch, were at this time inhabiting Ireland, having driven the Irish, Picts, out of Scotland, while the Picts, originally Scots, were now Irish, living in brackets, and vice versa. It is essential to keep these distinctions clearly in mind, and vice versa.
A lot of gibberish with the merest hint of truth. The Gaels of Dalriada eventually became the Scots. The progenitors of the Picts were a diverse group of semi-related tribes which eventually coalesced into 7 kingdoms, which further united into the kingdom of the Picts. The Scots and the Picts joined forces to battle the Viking invasions, merging into the kingdom of Alba, later becoming Scotland. Whew. There are 2 major errors in this one small paragraph. One is that the paragraph is laced with parentheses, but they seem to be referred to as brackets. I think that's a British versus American usage issue. West of the pond, those roundish things are parentheses. Brackets are square. The second is more egregious and would only be uttered by an Englishman. The first sentence reads, quote, "The Scots, ... by now Scotch, ... Wrong! Scotch refers to whiskey or tape, never to the country or its people. Proper words are Scot, Scots, and Scottish."
The brutal Saxon invaders drove the Britons westward into Wales and compelled them to become Welsh. It is now considered doubtful whether this was a good thing. Memorable among the Saxon warriors were Hengist and his wife, or horse, Horsa. Hengist made himself king in the south. Thus, Hengist was the first English king, and his wife, or horse, Horsa, the first English queen, or horse.
More nonsense. First, there was no Saxon invasion. It was more of a migration. And the original immigrants were not Saxons, but Jutes, today's Danes. What happened is not actually known. The problem is that there is really only one source for the story, and it was written 300 years after the supposed events, 300 miles away. So, what I have to say here must be preceded with phrases like supposedly and semi-legendary, and taken with the proverbial grain of salt. Once upon a time, there was a British tribal chieftain or warlord or something of that kind named Vortigern, who styled himself King of the Britons.
King of the who?
Although there wouldn't be any such thing for another 500 years or so. He was having trouble with his neighbors, i.e., they were all constantly at war with each other, and things were going bad for him. He sent word to the continent to see if he could hire some mercenaries. Some sources say these wars were with the Picts, but they were 400 miles away, so that's not likely. A number of boats arrived, at Thanet, of course. Really, or as real as the story gets. The few hundred men led by brothers called Hengist and Horsa. Brothers, not spouses. One of the few things Seller and Yateman got right is that Horsa does mean horse, but Hengist means stallion. One of those things that scholars find just a little too convenient. The Jutes won the war for Vortigern, but Hengist looked around, thought, hey, this is a pretty neat place. I think I'd like to rule it. So he set himself up as the first king of Kent. He brought friends and family over, by the hundreds, and established himself. Jutes, Angles, and Saxons were all somewhat related and lived near each other, so the news spread and they all decided to come.
The country was now almost entirely inhabited by Saxons and was therefore renamed England, and thus, naturally, soon became C of E. This was a good thing, because previously the Saxons had worshipped some dreadful gods of their own, called Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday.
The country was almost entirely inhabited by Britons, with small pockets of Saxons, Angles, and Jutes throughout the southeast. Of course, over the ensuing decades and centuries, these Germanic tribes spread far and wide across the island, which was called England because of the Angles, not the Saxons. C of E, Church of England, didn't come along until Henry VIII, over 1,100 years later. Days of the week were largely named after gods, except Sunday and Monday, days of the sun and moon. Tuesday through Friday are Norse, Tyr, Woden, Thor, Frigg, and Saturday is Roman, Saturn.
And that's Chapter 2. The lack of any chronology made this much more difficult than Chapter 1, because events didn't follow any sequence, and many of them were actually centuries apart. But that's why this is so much fun. So, until next time, don't forget to feed the cats.